President, Democrats continue to push forward with their partisan COVID legislation. The House of Representatives passed the Democrats' $1.9 trillion partisan wish list on Saturday, and the Senate is expected to take it up later this week. Just weeks after the President expressed his commitment to unity at his inauguration, he and his party are forcing through exclusively partisan legislation despite Republicans' clear willingness to negotiate. Mr. President, when it comes to the Democrats' COVID bill, President Biden keeps asking, what would you have me cut? As if there's no way anyone could dispute the necessity of anything in this legislation. Well, Mr. President, as I said last week, I have some suggestions, because this bill is rife with unnecessary and problematic provisions. Democrats are presenting this as a COVID relief bill, but a lot of this bill has little to do with responding to the pandemic. In fact, Mr. President, less than 10% of the bill is directly related to combating the COVID health crisis. If President Biden would like to know what to cut, let me suggest starting with the bill's $350 billion slush fund for states. Now, there's no question that COVID has placed additional pressure on states, which is why Republicans supported targeted funding for states in previous COVID legislation. But at this point, the vast majority of states are not in crisis. A number of states actually saw higher tax revenues in 2020, and a majority of states, including my home state of South Dakota, have the resources that they need to weather the rest of the pandemic. Even if the federal government bailed out those states that are still struggling, some at least partially because of their own mismanagement, $350 billion far exceeds the amount that would be needed. Democrats are simply providing a large and unnecessary giveaway to states with the distribution formula heavily weighted in favor of blue states. Then there's the bill's funding for schools. Now, Republicans are committed to getting schools reopened so our kids can get back to the in-person learning that they need. It's why we voted for $68 billion in COVID funding for K-12 schools last year. But right now, Mr. President, schools don't need additional funding. So far, K-12 schools have spent just $5 billion of the $68 billion that we provided them. Yet the Democrats' bill would provide nearly $129 billion in additional funding. And despite all that additional and unnecessary money, nothing in the bill would require schools to actually reopen. Schools could collect this money while still depriving students of the benefits of in-person learning. And another thing, Mr. President, Democrats are billing this legislation as a COVID relief bill and suggesting that it's providing urgently needed funding. Yet 95% of the bill's money for schools, 95%, would be spent after this year. That's right. Just 5% of this quote-unquote emergency funding would be spent in 2021. The rest would be spent between 2022 and 2028. Are we really supposed to believe that money that would be spent in 2028, years after the pandemic is likely to be over, is somehow urgently needed COVID relief funding? Well, Mr. President, I could go on for a while here with suggestions for what to cut in this bill. I'm pretty sure that $100 million for a Silicon Valley underground rail project doesn't have a lot to do with getting our country out of the COVID crisis. Or how about the $1.5 million for a bridge in the Democrat leader's home state? And then there's the $86 billion bailout for multi-employer pension plans. Billions for environmental policies, and a provision to ensure that Planned Parenthood and labor unions can apply for Paycheck Protection Program loans designed to help small businesses. I'm not sure how far that will go toward helping our economy, but it will certainly help fill the coffers of some of Democrats' political allies. Mr. President, if Democrats were really just focused on COVID relief, this would be a much smaller and targeted bill. But Democrats' ambitions were much larger than just addressing the COVID crisis. As a Democrat political operative famously said, never allow a good crisis to go to waste. Well, Democrats have taken that advice and are using the COVID crisis as cover for a whole list of partisan priorities with potentially very negative consequences. The Democrats' COVID bill runs a very real risk of overstimulating the economy, as evidenced by the large increase we've seen in money supply, which could, among other things, drive up prices on the goods that Americans use every day. In other words, inflation, Mr. President. Even some liberal economists have sounded the alarm over the size of the Democrats' coronavirus legislation. And then, of course, there's the danger posed by further driving up our debt. Now, we had to borrow a lot of money last year to meet the demands of the coronavirus crisis. And while it was money we needed to borrow, we need to be very aware of the fact that we added a substantial amount to our already very large national debt. We need to be very careful about any additional borrowing and ensure that we're only borrowing what's absolutely necessary. I think it goes without saying, Mr. President, that the more that we borrow, the more debt we have to retire. If something negative happened on interest rates and interest rates normalized, went back to a more normal setting, that the interest itself on that amount of debt would literally dwarf anything else that we do in our budget, including defending the country. And that, Mr. President, I believe is a very, very real threat. Because if you look at what's happening right now with the economy and with all the money that we've flooded out there so far, and another $2 trillion if the Democrats have their way in this particular proposal, and all that money out there starts pushing up those costs, we start seeing inflation in the economy, it doesn't take very long for interest rates to go with it. In fact, they already are. And if those interest rates start pushing up very quickly on the amount of debt that we are piling up, financing that debt, the amount of interest, the cost of interest on that debt would be absolutely overwhelming and devastating to this country. And so, Mr. President, we need to be very, very careful about any additional borrowing and ensure that we are only borrowing what's absolutely necessary. And that means making sure that anything we do in terms of additional pandemic relief is targeted and fiscally responsible. And that does not include money for a bridge in New York or a taxpayer bailout for mismanaged states. Mr. President, it's deeply disappointing that Democrats chose to turn their backs on bipartisanship. Republicans were ready to work with Democrats on additional targeted relief. And as I have pointed out before, the pandemic has been an issue on which, at least up until now, there's been very much bipartisan support. Last year, when Republicans were in the majority, we did five coronavirus bills, all bipartisan, all done at the 60-vote threshold that governs most legislation that moves through the Senate in a cooperative way. In this case, the Democrats are plowing forward, pushing this legislation in a very partisan way, Mr. President, and I think that's unfortunate, given our history on this issue of bipartisanship and the importance of making sure that we are doing the right things on behalf of the American people to help them get through this pandemic. Choosing to pursue a partisan process allows Democrats to stuff the bill with unnecessary spending and political payoffs. But that is not the way to help our country or our economy recover. Mr. President, I yield the floor, and I suggest the